Hello and welcome everyone to the inclusiveaccess.org webcast entitled Is Opt-in the Future of Inclusive Access? Thank you all so much for joining, and we are really excited to see the overwhelming amount of interest in this topic and want to thank everyone for joining us live and also for those who are tuning in to watch the recording. So a little bit about inclusiveaccess.org. It's a community-driven initiative to raise awareness of the facts about automatic textbook billing, recognizing that most campuses often hear about it from vendor marketing, which doesn't always address the challenges this model can create for students and faculty. So today's webcast is prompted by the recent negotiated rulemaking by the U.S. Department of Education, which could lead to a change in federal regulations that will require inclusive access programs to shift from an opt-out model to a model where students opt in. So for this webcast today, we have three amazing speakers that I am very excited to introduce to you all that will address various aspects of this topic. So first off, we have Nicole Allen, who is the Director of Open Education for Spark, who will start off with providing background on this issue and some of the concerns that have been prompted, that have prompted the Biden administration to look into this issue. Next up, we have Dr. Liliana Diaz, who is a Senior Policy Analyst for WICHE, who will discuss the Department of Education's rulemaking process and where it stands. And then last but not least, we will hear from Dr. Wendy Howard, who is the Director of Pegasus Innovation Lab for Digital Learning at the University of Central Florida, which is one of the only campuses in the country to have a successful and long-standing opt-in inclusive access program. So there will be time at the end for people to ask questions, and if any questions come up during any one of our speakers talking, we really welcome you to submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to make sure that we don't lose any questions. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Nicole.
Well, thank you so much. All right, so I am going to start with stepping back a little bit and talking about where did inclusive access come from? What are some of the concerns that are coming up on college campuses that have brought us to the current policymaking environment, and some thoughts on where things could go next. So before I start, I just want to acknowledge I work for Spark, which is a national nonprofit organization. We do have a position on inclusive access, which is that we're concerned about the impact that it has for students and faculty. And my role here today is not necessarily to talk about the things that you will hear from vendors about inclusive access. It's to present sort of the other side of the story and some of the concerns that often don't get discussed in conversations that happen on campus that are driven by vendors. So the goal is to provide you with information that you can use to decide for yourselves what's right for your students in your campus. So taking a step back and just talking about like, how did we get here? You know, we're here because textbook costs are a major challenge for students. We've been in an environment where textbook prices have increased many times the rate of inflation for multiple decades. This graph shows the last 2 decades, but keep in mind, there were 2 decades before this with textbook prices rapidly increasing every year. And though there's been some sort of disruption in more recent years, you know, the historical trend is very clear of which direction textbook prices go. And part of that is because the textbook market doesn't work like a normal consumer market. Students are essentially captive consumers because they have to buy whatever materials they've been assigned by faculty. And of course, it should work that way because faculty are best equipped to make those decisions, but it does create this dynamic where publishers and other vendors are in a position to be able to price materials very high and be able to sort of extract a lot of money from students who are really, you know, in a position where they're already struggling to afford their education. So there's a market problem here, exacerbated by the fact that it's dominated by just a handful of vendors that control large shares of the market. So there just like isn't a lot of competition. But the good news is that, well, perhaps not good news, but better news is that over the last decade, there has been some changes. There have been a lot more ways for students to get access to cost-saving strategies and be able to save money in a variety of different ways. This is one study done in 2022 with Florida students, found that 88% of students engage in some strategy to reduce how much they spend on textbooks, whether that's, buying used books, renting digital textbooks, selling used books, sharing with classmates. Libraries have reserve programs. Open educational resources are a big factor. And as a result of this, we've seen a trend where textbook spending has actually been headed down over the last decade. And you can hear quotes from publisher executives talking about the fact that, all of these alternatives have actually disrupted the way that they're able to price textbooks and sort of force them to find ways to charge students less, which is positive. But it also creates a problem for textbook companies who have, delivered lots of money for their shareholders for many years. And in 2016, there was actually a change in federal regulations that offered a bit of a lifeline to the industry, which was actually really struggling with the fact that they really had to compete with like all of these used books and other alternatives. And that's the regulation that the Biden administration is currently looking at changing, in which Liliana will talk a lot about in a little bit more detail in a bit. But basically, what it did was make it possible for institutions to automatically bill students for textbooks through their tuition and fees. And that's where the inclusive access model was invented, as a way to essentially capitalize on that ability to directly charge students essentially charge every student in a class unless they found a way to opt out. So how does inclusive access work? I think it's worth just quickly addressing this so that we're all on the same page, because these programs are called different things on different campuses. This model, it's a textbook sales model that's based on an agreement between an institution, usually it's bookstore, and any number of publishers that are providing content. They provide digital materials to students delivered on the first day of class. The cost gets billed to the students, tuition and fee bill, and then there's a period that students can opt out of getting billed. And then after the course ends, students typically lose access to the content, usually because it's digital, but also often because if it's in print, it's like a print rental. And there are two main ways that these programs are implemented on campuses. The first is on a course-by-course basis, where there are some courses that do it and some courses that don't. And students just get, automatically billed whatever the price of the material in their course is through their tuition and fees. And then the second model is a flat fee, or what is often known as like equitable access model, where students get charged a flat fee per credit hour, regardless of what materials they're assigned. This is how a course-by-course program might look like to students. And the first course is not an inclusive access course, and the second course is. You can see that there are fees associated, and then there's a little bit of information about how to opt out. This is actually a really good example of how a campus can implement this. A lot of them aren't this transparent. And then this is an example of a flat fee campus, where they're charging $25 per credit hour for access to all of your materials. All right. So in terms of a side-by-side comparison of these two models, I would say right now, most campuses that implement inclusive access do it on a course-by-course basis, but increasing numbers have been starting to do it on the flat fee or so-called equitable access basis, driven largely by vendors, especially Barnes and Noble and to an extent Follett, that have sort of been pushing campuses to move in this model because it is more profitable for them. And some of the concerns that we have, well, we have concerns about both of these models, but specifically the flat fee or equitable access model comes with a few significant concerns that have been raised in discussions about this on campus. Is that, first of all, opt-out is all or nothing. So if students are taking a course that forces them to stay opted in, they have to opt in for the whole thing, even if they'd save money by opting out. It also requires all faculty and all courses to participate, or at least at a program level. And there are many faculty, for example, who assign OER who believe that, if they're assigning a free open educational resource, their students should get to benefit from those savings. And that's one of the big challenges of these programs. We've already heard, just sort of anecdotally, as programs shift toward flat fee, there are fewer and fewer faculty who are adopting OER or being as price sensitive because the cost to their own student doesn't change based on the material that they're assigning. So I want to take a minute and talk a little bit about some of the concerns with the inclusive access model that have led to this being addressed at a federal level. So the first and biggest thing is that inclusive access, it is often marketed as a solution for textbook affordability, but the problem that it solves is a procurement problem. How do students get their textbooks? When the underlying problem is a market problem, that textbooks are too expensive, and there is that sort of broken market captive consumer dynamic that gives textbook companies the ability to drive prices higher with abandon and without accountability. So, the ability for inclusive access to actually solve any problems is inherently limited, because the only thing it changes is how students buy textbooks, not how they're priced in general. Second, the claims that are made by vendors about these programs offering student savings and improving student outcomes are really just not backed by strong evidence, and at best are really incremental. And then the fact that these programs are implemented largely on an opt-out basis really disincentivizes competition, because it sort of guarantees those sales to specific vendors rather than, making them compete for students' business and letting students shop around for the best price and voting with their feet. So I'm going to delve into a few specifics that will help illustrate these points. So first, I want to show you, this is just a screenshot of Cengage, one of the big textbook publishers' website, talking about their inclusive access program and how it's a solution. There's a claim on the website that it saves students 71% on textbooks, which sounds really good. But if you actually click into that example, you actually see that it says, actually, students save 71% off of print list prices, when that's really not a fair comparison, because with the inclusive access programs, students aren't getting a print book that they can keep or resell or share with another student. They're getting a short-term digital subscription that they're not going to have access to for a long time in most cases, and they don't have something that they can keep or sell back. So this is just a little bit misleading. And if you actually go in and look at the contracts, the fine print behind inclusive access programs, you see that the actual discounts look a little bit more like this, like 20%, often, 10, 15, 20%. 20% is usually the maximum. And first of all, 20% off of the then current online purchase price does not make that price affordable. 20% off is better than paying full price, but is 20% worth automatically billing every single student in that class, including some who can't afford it, don't want that digital book, would save more money by shopping around online, would save money by using a copy in the library or sharing a copy with other students? So, these discounts are not as large when you actually look at what you're getting. And, I think it's also worth pointing out that this is like, those stores at the mall that always have a sale going on. When, you can always walk into the store and get 20% off. Well, that's not a sale. It's just the price. It's the price that they want you to pay. So discounts can really be misleading. And then I think it's also important to keep in mind that there are these other clauses that prices can change anytime. That, in this contract, Pearson reserves the right to annually adjust the prices. Sometimes they're allowed to adjust at any time. And at the end of the day, if the textbook companies are setting the base price, discounts really become meaningless because they're just going to increase the base price to make however much money they want to make off of the students. And then there's nothing students can ultimately do about that. All right, so that's probably more relevant to a course by course inclusive access context. I think it becomes a lot clearer when we start looking at the equitable access or flat fee model, because you can see the big picture, right? You know exactly how much students are spending per year in these models because it's a flat fee. And this is a screenshot of the Barnes & Noble website, which is one of the vendors that really pushes this model. And it's a cost calculator. And, you know, first of all, this cost calculator is comparing apples to oranges. It's comparing a program that only provides access to course materials to a books and supplies budget, which is different. But $720 charged to every single student in a program, that is not affordable. First of all. Second of all, if you actually remember that point I made earlier that textbook spending has actually been falling, and look at what the National Association of College Stores that represents the bookstore industry, they say that student spending fell to $339 per student per year last year. So this equitable access program wants to charge $720 a year, where the average student is spending half of that on course materials. And, you know, that this $339 is thanks to students being able to shop around, OER, rentals, and all of that. You know, why are we trading this for that with a straight face? And, you know, the $720 a year number for these programs, and that's for a full 30 credit load, is not always what is charged. There was actually just a case in Connecticut where the state college and university system considered and ultimately ended up voting down switching to one of these programs that would have charged $560 per year for a 30 credit load. But it actually came out in the discussions about this that, you know, the campuses have really robust OER programs, and at one of the campuses, like less than half of the courses were using paid materials. And it also came out that UConn, another university in the state, they switched to one of these programs, and in the first semester, 70% of the students opted out of it. You know, that number went down in subsequent semesters, but, you know, there were really significant concerns raised, and when it was sort of put under a microscope, you know, even that $560 per year number was not seen as compelling enough to move in this direction. So I think this is where, you know, facts really matter. And this is, you know, this is a quote from a student, and I think it just really sums up what I hear a lot from students. And it's that, you know, I could almost always find materials cheaper. I was not pleased I was being charged without being informed. It took way too many steps to opt out. The student concerns with the inclusive access model have really been what's driving the push for regulatory change. You know, these processes can be really complex and difficult to find or navigate for students. It, you know, prevents students from shopping around, or at least disincentivizes it. And opting out is not always an option, when if students opt out, they'll be denied access to homework or tests if they're assigned courseware or materials that are required to get the maximum grade in the course. And the negative consequences of an opt-out model are going to disproportionately affect students who can least afford it. You know, the students who are harmed by a model that could inadvertently charge students more than they should have paid, or charge them without them realizing it, it's going to hurt the students who can least afford it. And I think that's why this model is ultimately just like inherently inequitable, and why it's so important that we're talking about a transition to opt-in. And, you know, yes, the textbook industry will come back and say, well, first day access helps students. And you'll see all sorts of case studies, and there's this researcher, Mike Moore, who's published a bunch of case studies about this that show that, with inclusive access programs, more students have access to their materials and do better. But if you actually look at some of the more rigorous, larger scale studies, this evidence does not bear out. This is a large scale study done in Tennessee that looks across multiple courses and multiple institutions, and actually found that there was not an impact on academic outcomes. It didn't harm academic outcomes, but it didn't increase academic outcomes in a statistically significant way. So if these programs aren't necessarily saving students money and they're not necessarily improving academic outcomes, but they're taking away student choices, are they the best model for our students? So I want to wrap up by just providing my take on the question we're here to answer: is the future of inclusive access opt-in? First, why Spark supports opt-in. Offering a real choice, it incentivizes competition, which is better, especially in a market that really lacks competition. Opt-in ensures students are informed and aware, there's transparency, and they can make decisions based on their own financial circumstances rather than those students who can least afford it being those most harmed by an opt-out system. And I think it's just important to just say that forcing students to buy their materials through one of these opt-out programs is not a long-term solution for affordability or student success. It's not going to make textbooks affordable in the long run because publishers still are in charge of pricing, and it's not a solution for student success if all you're doing is forcing students to buy their materials. I also like what this student says. If inclusive access truly offers benefits to students, then proponents of this model have nothing to fear. If they offer real savings, students are going to rush to opt into them. And if they don't, we won't and shouldn't have to. So is the future opt-in? I think if it's possible to have an opt-out mechanism, it's possible to have an opt-in mechanism. So it definitely could be. We know that vendors, bookstores, publishers, platforms, they have a strong profit incentive to avoid opt-in programs and are likely going to do or say anything to prevent it. Publishers are already telling institutions that they're going to revoke discounts if they move to an opt-in model. Textbook publishers are all over the Capitol Hill talking about trying to stop this potential rulemaking. At least one bookstore company is emailing faculty asking them to contact the Department of Education and Congress about this. And vendors can say something isn't possible when it is possible, and it's not possible until it is. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and on your campuses, keep that in mind when in discussion with vendors about this. And then I think can these programs demonstrate their value when students have a choice? We'll have to see. All right, so last thoughts, just, encourage you to recommend your institution to, maybe hold off on making big decisions about this until we're clear on what the rules are going to be, because I think there really is an opportunity to push for an opt-in model in the long run. I think in the short term, if you can push in that direction, fantastic. It's going to be better for students, and depending on what does happen with the rulemaking, it could future-proof your program. And just think beyond incremental solutions. Open educational resources really help solve that market problem and provide first-day access to students forever for free. And really fight to protect your OER programs from those flat fee charges. If you can at least get a carve out for those, that can really help students. So that is all by way of background. I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Liliana to speak to us about the Department of Education rulemaking.
Perfect. Thank you, Nicole. And can people see my screen? Awesome. Great. So thank you all for being here today. And we thought it'd be very helpful to give you some background on what is negotiated rulemaking, because it is a very obscure process by which the federal government and some of the federal agencies create policies and provisions. And additionally, what the language is that the Department of Education knows as far as its automatic the billing of what it just talked about. So what is negotiated rulemaking? So to set kind of a level playing field, I'm going to describe that at a very high level. So there's a lot of intricacies, but just for negotiated rulemaking 101. So negotiated rulemaking, commonly known as NAGREG, is a process that the U.S. Department of Education utilizes to update certain federal provisions and regulations. So usually this can include a lot of different provisions, but definitely the ones that are most common is Title IV funding, which can include that federal financial aid, as well as Higher Education Act government programs. The Department of Education then convenes a committee of negotiators, and these are stakeholders that represent all the different buckets of folks that are going to be impacted by that provision. So this could include community colleges, students, four-year universities, for-profit, private, as well as civil rights, advocacy organizations. So they try to cover the gamut of who would be impacted by the provision, and they try to have representation from all of those folks as part of the negotiator pool. We'll then have a series of meetings to discuss what the provisions that have been proposed by the department are. And the goal is to reach consensus among all of the negotiators. So they discuss it, they debate, they argue the merits, pros, cons, with the hope to reach consensus on the provision. As the meetings go forward, the department takes into consideration what the negotiators are sharing, saying, and will make edits throughout the process to the language that is being used. Well, then the department will provide that language as it's updated through negotiators, continue updating it, and then it'll arrive at, do the negotiators have consensus on the proposed language? If they do not, then the department can draft its own language for the provision. And then it'll submit that as its proposal when consensus is not reached. So where does the process currently stand? So the department announced the program integrity and institutional quality negotiated rulemaking last April, and then it started convening the committee in early January of negotiators. The negotiators met for a series of 3 sessions, which just ended in March, to discuss what they term issue papers. And the issue papers are what include the provisional language that the department has proposed, as well as the subsequent edits that happen as we move forward in the process. There was significant debate between institutions and publishers, as well as the Department of Education, as well as students and consumer advocates, on the pros and cons of moving this provision as it relates to audit and textbook billing. The committee did not reach consensus, so it left the Department of Education free to develop a language for the proposed regulations that it needs to see. So what is the proposed change? So before we jump into that, we thought it'd be helpful to have some terminology on things that you're going to hear. So of course, Title IV aid, which is federal financial aid, which includes federal student loans, as well as comprehensive other forms of aid. Cash management, which is kind of the section of the federal regulations that concerns how institutions manage students' Title IV aid, federal financial aid. And authorization, pretty much how students and parents are informed and how they gather or give institutions permission to use those Title IV funds to pay for certain charges that are assessed by institutions. So we can find all of the current regulations, in the National Archives, but for this one, the Code of Federal Regulations, as it pertains to what we're talking about today, is under Title 34, which talks about education, And I can put subpart B, chapter 6, part 668. As you can see, there's a lot in there. But what we're interested in is subpart A, which is cash management, and then section 668.161, which is the dispersing of funds. That's what we're talking about, and that's what the provision of automatic textbook billing falls under section subpart A's cash management. So under section 668.164, dispersing of funds, this pretty much outlines how institutions and what can institutions assess billing for and how they can utilize Title IV funds to pay for certain expenses that students accrue at an institution. So this outlines, how tuition fees, room and board are assessed, and how institutions can utilize Title IV funding to pay for those charges, as well as for the purchasing of books and supplies and other educational and related goods. As Nicole referenced earlier, in 2016, there was changes to the provisions as they're stated here that would allow, go forward, for current regulations for third-party agreements to offer materials at below or competitive market rates, as long as they're provided within 7 days of the start of the term, and that the students are provided out policy. So currently, what this means is that students can be automatically billed without their authorization. So that is how the system is currently organized, or the provision currently outlines that students do not have to authorize their federal financial dollars to cover certain expenses. The institution does that decision. So the proposal that has been submitted by the department pretty much changes this to an opt-out or an opt-out in. So institutions can automatically bill students for books and supplies only if they obtain the student's authorization. If they disclose the prices before students give authorization each term and chooses to purchase materials from the institution. So in essence, the student goes from opt-out to an opt-in. And the materials are offered a below competitive market rates. There is some exception here for the proposed language. It does recognize that some students might not have the privilege of being able to choose, especially if they're confined or incarcerated. So it does allow for automatic billing for students in these situations. Now, what does this mean? So institutions can still have inclusive access and equitable access programs, but the policy or the default policy would just need to be to opt in rather than opt out. And existing programs would need to make that appropriate changes to fall into compliance with the new and final rule if that passes forward. Importantly, students would still need to be able to use their financial aid to pay for books and supplies voluntarily as it currently exists. Now, how likely is opt-in rule to be adopted? So currently, right now, what we're waiting for is for the Department of Education to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. So if you hear NPRM, that's what it references, a notice of proposed rulemaking. And pretty much this is kind of the final revision as it's languaged out by the department. And there will be a period to submit public comment. This is usually about 30 days. And then the department will take all those comments and propose and publish a final ruling. Final rules that are published by November 1st take effect July 1st of the following year. So in this case, if the rules are published by November 1st, 2024, those rules will take in effect July 1st, 2025. If they are published after November 1st, then they are published following year, 2 years, so July 1st of 2026. Now, there are many factors that impact timing, so it's really hard to predict when the department will publish the NPRM and what that provision will say. So that's why we're anxiously waiting to see what the department will publish. Now, there have been some communication from the White House as well as the United States Senate In referencing kind of what the department is proposing, so we like to share those out with all our folks so they're aware of kind of what's happening. So that's kind of where we are in the process. So we're anxiously waiting and to see what it says, and then it'll be open to the community, to the wider, to the country for. So that's where we are in the process. Hopefully that dispelled a little bit of the obscurity of the negotiated rulemaking process. And then with that, I will pass it on to my colleague, Wendy Howard, who will talk a little bit more about her institution and their opt-in.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to share the UCF story. I will share my screen very quickly. Perfect. So thank you again for the opportunity to share UCF story after laying such a great background to this whole debate. What I found personally in my conversations with colleagues around the country is that often many folks don't even realize that opt-in exists, that it's even an option. So in most of my conversations, when we talk about inclusive access, most folks are assuming that we're talking about opt-out. So I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to share what appears to be a relatively unique experience at the University of Central Florida. I think, Liliana, you did a great job of explaining the difference between opt-in and opt-out. I'll continue to give some examples as I talk through this. But to clarify, using the terminology that Nicole started with, we are using an opt-in model course by course basis at UCF. So just to set the tone, we're not doing the flat fee model at all. Everything is course by course. So when I look back and I think about the UCF story, it kind of occurs in 3 phases. And so we had our initial implementation back in 2018 is when we started looking into seriously implementing inclusive access. We are a Barnes & Noble campus, and so their inclusive access program is branded as First Day. So if I talk about First Day, that's our opt-in inclusive access program at UCF. So at the time in 2018, all of the Florida public universities were required to do opt-in if we were going to do an inclusive access program. We didn't have an option. All 12 universities had to do opt-in if we were going to do any kind of inclusive access. So we just started initially with that in mind. We didn't even look at the opt-out version. So when we started to implement, we started with a pilot in spring of 2019 with one very, very large marketing course that used McGraw-Hill courseware. So based on that pilot, it was, like I said, a very large course. Based on the list price, we saved over $60,000 to our students in that one summer or spring course. And that, of course, was based on list price to respond to Nicole's earlier presentation. But that did go very smoothly from a technical perspective, from a implementation perspective in terms of the faculty member and the student feedback. So we proceeded then the following semester, summer of 2019, we did 3 pilots, one with each one with a different publisher. So we continued on with McGraw-Hill, and then we added a pilot with Pearson and another pilot with Wiley. Those went very well. So then the following fall, we just opened it up widely for any publisher that was in the program through Barnes & Noble and any course at UCF where the instructor chose to implement. So the rationale behind implementing this inclusive access program opt-in was mainly for 2 primary benefits. Yes, the discount was an added bonus, but the primary benefit that we saw was the deferred payment. So we have for many, many years looked at textbook affordability at UCF, and we've been trying to find many different ways to tackle that. And we just found that a lot of our students simply chose to not buy their textbook because they needed that money for other things, rent, food, what have you. And then there were many students who had to delay purchasing their textbooks until their financial aid came through, which was typically a couple of weeks into the term. And so what we found particularly intriguing about this program was students automatically got access to their the digital course materials on the first day of class and could defer that payment through their student account. So they weren't starting out a little bit behind for those first 2 weeks. So emphasizing those two primary benefits is why we move forward with the program. Again, we are on a course-by-course model. We have been from the very beginning, which means our faculty first choose if they want to participate in the program. So it's almost like a two-step opt-in. First, the instructor has to choose to use the program in their course section. And then secondly, each individual student then has the autonomy to decide if they want to opt into the program. The biggest difference between the opt-in and the opt-out is really the default setting if students take no action. And so by making it a choice for the student to opt in, they automatically have access to their digital course materials at the beginning of the term for the first 2 weeks up until the end of the odd drop window. At that point, if they opt in, they continue their access at the discounted price. If they do not opt in, if they take no action, then their student account is not charged. And then it's back to what it would normally be if they weren't in the Inclusive Access program. They can seek their materials elsewhere. What we found is that most of the impact occurs when there's courseware involved versus e-texts. I think Nicole did a really good job of emphasizing there are many other ways that students can find e-textbooks, whether it's sharing with another peer or finding it someplace else. But the courseware, you're really locked into only accessing it through the publisher. And so that's where we've seen the greatest access. So moving on then, we did have a very positive pilot. So we decided to implement institution-wide with the 2 levels of opting in, first the instructor, then the student. And a couple years later, we hit a crossroad. So in the state of Florida, the Board of Governors then gave the public universities the option to either stay opt-in or move to opt-out. So they removed that restriction that we all needed to be opt-in. And so at that point, we did give opt-out some consideration. We were given the option to pursue either one at UCF, and we did receive a little bit of pressure. I'll be totally transparent. We received some pressure from the bookstore, from the publishers, because it seemed like everybody else had gone to opt out, and we were the Lone Ranger standing in an opt-in position. And also, it would be, quite frankly, easier to administer if we had moved to opt out. So the system was, the platform was really modified or written so that it could be used either way, but over time, it was a lot easier for an opt out. I can get into more details with that, but basically there's a bit of a manual reporting process for the opt-in right now. And also we would technically have a longer window if we weren't the lone man standing as opt-in only, because of that manual process. A report goes from the publisher to the bookstore to our financial aid office, and they process the opt-in before they can release financial aid to everybody. So there's a little bit of a window shortening there for our opt-in right now because of the manual steps involved. So when we were at that crossroad, we did consider opt-out. And probably one of the major factors in reconsidering and staying opt-in was, quite frankly, student advocacy. We have a very active student group on campus, Wiki Nights, who were very vocal in having their voices heard, that they had serious concerns about opt-out. And so we stopped the whole process and took some time to conduct some focus groups. So my vice provost of digital learning, and also the dean at the time, the dean of the College of Undergraduate Studies, conducted a series of focus groups with both faculty and students separately, but conducted those focus groups to really get more frontline input on that decision. And overwhelmingly, the feedback was stay opt-in, give students the most autonomy over their decision-making as possible. Quite frankly, the concern was over the default setting behavior. If students take no action, then their student account does not get charged if we stay opt-in. And so that was the primary reason for staying opt-in. Through those focus groups, I heard even the term paternalistic used if we were to go to opt-out. The main argument, other than convenience of administration, the main argument to go opt-out was from some of the faculty members who required courseware, and the only way a student could successfully pass their course was if they submitted assignments through the courseware. And so they wanted to force students into the discounted price, kind of for their own good, right? So it's very well-meaning, but that was the only reason to perhaps consider staying opt-out that we heard through the focus groups. And so overwhelmingly, we heard stay opt-in, we stuck with that. And so now that brings us to our current state in 2024. We do hear quite often from publishers, from our bookstore, that we are the last of the opt-in holdouts. And so some of our challenges have been, I kind of alluded to this earlier, have been that the platform inside of the LMS, we use Canvas. So when students are inside of Canvas and they get to the page where they can opt in, it's very vague, the language that is used there, because it needs to be broad enough to accommodate both opt-out and opt-in. And there's no way for us to customize that and put in language that explains the opt-in process and how it works and what the difference is. So that's been one challenge. And then the other challenge that we've really struggled with is we have a lot of transfer students, particularly coming from our state colleges. We have a Direct Connect program where many of our students start out their first 2 years at a state college in Florida and then transfer to UCF for the second 2 years. And many of our state colleges are using an opt-out model. So our transfer students log into a course that is using the first day program, and they see the screen for the first day, and they're like, oh, I know what that is. And they do nothing because they're used to an opt-out model. And so we have a lot of students that are confused about that when their access is cut off at the end of the opt-in window, and they're questioning, why did I lose my access? So I think I saw somebody mention in the chat that one of the biggest challenges, either direction, is really student communications and making sure it's clear to them, how this program works and what the consequences are to the choice to opt in, opt out, or do nothing. And so, so we're very sensitive to that. It is a challenge. I suppose if everybody were to go to opt in, it would be less of a challenge if it was a consistent program across the board. So of course, we're hoping that the legislation goes through. But it is important to be very clear in the student communications. And we also try to hit them from every angle through their Canvas course, through their instructor, through the bookstore. We do have a great relationship with our on-campus bookstore manager. So we work very closely to try to communicate with students, but there's still a lot of confusion. So I will move on because I realize we're short on time, but I wanted to share a little bit of our statistics with the First Day program. And we do track student savings. We do track student statistics on opting in. And I will say the screenshot shows a little bit of a dip in summer where maybe there was something weird going on last summer, but consistently semester over semester, we have about a 2/3 opt-in rate. The students who do not opt in are primarily those, you'll see the statistics, are primarily those who take no action. It's usually about 1 or 2% that take the opportunity to say, no, I'm definitely opting out. But the vast majority of those that don't take advantage of the program are just taking no action. But we typically hover between 60 and 70% opt-in. That's consistent from one semester to the next. And we are a large institution. So if you look at the number of sections this current semester, we are just shy of 1,200 course sections. That represents roughly 20% of the total course sections. What I'd like to point out, though, is that 20% represents one aspect in our overall textbook affordability strategy. So we do try to encourage and advocate for OER wherever we can. We work very closely with the library to try to increase library sourced offerings for our students. We try very hard to work with faculty individually to look for those options first. We lead with OER and library sourced materials, but that doesn't always fit every single course. And so, so oftentimes this is a great next step, is to look at inclusive access as a way of providing some form of savings. I will also share that in the state of Florida, we have a program called Affordability Counts. And we set at the state level a threshold of $20 per credit hour that a lot of the publishers are now aware of. And so when we're looking at negotiated discounts, they will often try to get the price of their materials under $20 per credit hour so that it gets that designation. And finally, what I will share is we do, like I said, track student savings based on list price. And I will put a link in the chat right now to the page that I'm sharing so that you can see the current statistics. So at this point, we've updated it for spring. Our spring numbers are in here, and collectively since that first pilot, we've saved our students over $20 million. So when you come out here, you can see that we break it down by semester, and we have the definition of how we're basing that on list price. So that's in a nutshell our experience at UCF. I want to make sure I save a few minutes for Q&A. So I will turn it back over to, I think, Nicole.
Great.
Thank-
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Aisha.
Thank you so
Oh,
much.
I'm sorry.
No,
Sorry,
you're
Alicia.
You're absolutely fine. Actually, I'm going to pass it back over to you, Wendy, for the first question. So Justin White has a question that says, why can't the language in Canvas be modified to clarify the opt-in process?
You know what? We ask Barnes and Noble corporate that all the time, and I wish we could. And the short answer is the platform needs to be versatile enough to accommodate both their opt-out and their opt-in institutions. And so it's very broad, generic language. And so that does not give us the ability to customize it, because they control the platform for that page that's embedded in Canvas where the students click opt-in. Or opt out.
Thank you, Wendy. And I see a few of you have been putting questions into the chat. So just a reminder to use the Q&A function so I can make sure that I see them. So the next question, Nicole, I'm going to direct towards you. And if you can address Farron's question in the Q&A.
Yes. So thanks for this question. So the question is about the issue of first day access. Their inclusive access program provides first day access, and that provides benefits to students. And the question was, can you help me understand? Oh no, the question just disappeared. Why? Can you help me understand how opt-in would work if students have the whole add drop time period to decide whether to opt in? So my understanding, and Wendy, you answer this for UCF, but my understanding is that there are plenty of textbook vendors that will offer first day access to courseware on a trial basis, even with the normal like self-procurement model. So there's no reason that opt-in programs wouldn't provide first day access. If you can provide an opt-out model, you can provide an opt-in model. And Wendy, correct me, is that how it works at UCF?
Yes, yeah. So it's negotiated with courseware just the same way it is with an e-textbook, directly between the bookstore and the publisher. And what it means for students then is the first day of class, they would have access to the courseware. It would continue to be available to them free of charge up until the end of the opt-in window. And if they have opted in at any time during that window, when we hit the end of the window, their access continues as though nothing has changed. Those students who took no action or actively selected opt out, their access gets cut off, and then they will see a screen that says, you know, please contact the publisher or go to your bookstore for access. And then they would buy it through the traditional means for whatever that courseware is.
Yeah, so the moral of the story is that vendors can absolutely provide first day access on an opt-in model. They just may tell you that they can't because they don't want to, and that's their prerogative, but it's not that it isn't possible.
Thank you. So we have time for a couple more questions, and Liliana and Wendy, if you want to answer any of the questions in the Q&A, please feel free to type them. I'm going to go ahead and ask the next question. I think, Nicole, you're best equipped to answer this. So do we know for flat fee or per credit hour fee models, how much variation is there in these fees from school to school or vendor to vendor?
Yeah, so we don't have a large amount of data on this, but we do, Spark offers a contract library that has, through public information requests, gathered quite a lot of information. You can find that here, and you can filter by flat fee programs. And we find that they generally range between $20 to $25 per credit hour, although there are plenty of outliers on either end. So that's like $600 to $750 a year for a full 30 credit load. So, you know, I think we really need to ask ourselves, is that the best we can really do for our students?
Okay, so it looks like we have time for one more question. So this one's for UCF. Does UCF have granular enough data on the opt-ins to determine how many of those courses had homework platforms rather than simply the e-textbooks?
Oh, that's a good question. I believe we can get that data from our bookstore, but it's not something that they automatically report back to us where I would have it on hand. But I believe that's data we could get access to if we requested. But I will say just anecdotally that like I mentioned earlier, the greater impact is probably through courseware, because e-text can be procured many different ways, whereas the courseware can only be obtained through the publisher.
Thank you. I know I said the last question was the last, but we have time for one more. So what did you do about students who did not opt in for the courses, like what you mentioned, where they can't pass the course without using the course management for homework, etc.?
I'm assuming that's for me. Yeah. It is unfortunate, but those students who don't opt in, then they have to resort to paying full price, right? So they have to go straight to the publisher or through the bookstore, whatever means they would have had that course not had the inclusive access to begin with. So if they started their coursework during the opt-in window, they wouldn't lose the work they had done, but they would have to go back and pay in order to continue where they left off. So that is something to consider. And it is unfortunate. What I found is the students who take no action, it's usually because they don't understand, they don't trust the program, or a lot of times there are parents who are saying, no, just do what I always did on the first day of class, go to the bookstore and buy everything you need. And so sometimes students, unfortunately, will miss out on that. But it is the model that gives them the most autonomy over their decision making.
Yeah. And noting what Wendy just described, that is how it works for a student who would have opted out in an opt-out program and then later discovers that they really needed to be opted in. So it's, you know, a challenge with the use of courseware in general. The difference is just at UCF, students aren't forced to pay for it by default.
Correct.
Yeah, so with that, we're at time. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Liliana, Wendy, Nicole, for your expertise, and thank you all for being super engaging. I was watching the chat and a lot of questions and a lot of great discussion. I'm just going to pass it off over to Nicole if she has any closing remarks before we end this.
No, just there's more information on inclusiveaccess.org if you're interested. As Liliana noted, the next step in this whole process is to watch the Federal Register for a notice. There will be a public comment period, you know, sort of wherever you stand on the issue, and encourage you to participate in that process. And, you know, thank you again. We've been overwhelmed by the interest in this topic. The recording will be posted on inclusiveaccess.org. And we will at least post the slides that I used, and we'll see about my colleagues to answer that question. And thank you all for coming.